Hello, everyone, and welcome to this extraordinary event triggered by an extraordinary crisis in Ukraine following the Russian invasion of that country. My name is Edward Joseph with Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, and I want to thank our excellent team here at SAIS FPI led by Cinnamon Dornseif, as well as the outstanding team at SAIS Events. Today, we're going to be looking at the ramifications of this crisis for the Balkans, a region that was already unsettled even before this crisis began on February 24th with the unprovoked Russian invasion. We have a distinguished group of experts joining us today from literally across the region. Every country in the Balkans, from Croatia to Turkey, is represented here. We're hoping to have an expert from Slovenia as well, although that may not be possible. To save time and to give these distinguished experts the maximum amount of time for their insights, I'm going to ask them now to turn on their cameras and just introduce them all to you collectively. And then later, I will introduce them each to you in sequence. So please, if everyone, all our distinguished experts could turn on their cameras, and they will be with you shortly. Now, let me mention the sequence for this program and introduce this to you, and I'm going to briefly share my screen here. Okay, you should be able to see my screen. So again, welcome to today's program, the Ukraine crisis in the Balkans, what risks, what changes. So to bring all of our experts to you in a logical fashion that everyone can process, we see the Ukraine war has put the Balkan states into three categories. First are the frontline states, and both with a land border or a sea, the Black Sea connection to Ukraine. And those are four states: Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, not a country in the Balkans, but deeply engaged in the Balkans, and of course a frontline state with a land border, and Turkey, also playing an extraordinary role in this crisis. So those will be our first group of experts. And again, in those states will appear, the experts will appear in alphabetical order. Now, by country name. The second category of states will be those that are highly influenced by Russia. That's Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia. And then finally, states that are NATO or pro-NATO. And those comprise the other six states of that region, from Albania to North Macedonia and Slovenia, in alphabetical order, again, as I mentioned. Now, what are the issues affecting the Balkans from the Ukraine crisis? Now, we could look at those perhaps in two baskets. This is somewhat arbitrary, but it's a way at least to think about the multitude of issues that affect the Balkans from this crisis. And we could call them direct and indirect. So especially for frontline countries, we have refugee flows already. In just 3 weeks or so, 3 million refugees plus. That rivals the total amount from the Balkans in all the wars in the 1990s. We have concerns about conflict escalation, and even concerns about the defense capabilities in some of these countries. And as well in the region, with EUFOR increasing its presence in Bosnia-Herzegovina. There's questions about weapon systems of support for Ukraine. The US Secretary of Defense is meeting with some of these key countries that have air defense systems that are critically needed and that Ukraine can use. These are Russian systems. There's a question of adherence to the sanctions regime. Serbia in particular, but Turkey as well, do not apply sanctions on Russia. And then finally, of course, there's the question of Russian-inspired or Russia-related destabilization scenarios in the region, and our experts will, of course, be looking at that. And then just quickly, there are indirect implications here: relations with Russia, relations with NATO, calls, for example, for Kosovo to join NATO, There's a question of what about the stalled EU enlargement process? Has Brussels been awakened from its slumber on this after this crisis? There's the question of the economic fallout. There are internal political questions that have flowed already. One minister, Bulgarian Minister of Defense, has been ousted over this crisis. And then finally, of course, we have the question of the ongoing ethno-national conflicts and tensions in the region and how those could be affected positively or negatively from the crisis. Are there some opportunities for the US and the EU flowing from this extraordinary crisis in Ukraine? So to process these, look, we know this is an unfolding crisis, and so there's no way to know for sure, but we can know already, we can identify some clear consequences of the Russian invasion. And on the negative side of the coin, we have what the Russian invasion has already discredited. And that list there should seem familiar to most people in the US and most of Western Europe, but of course in the Balkans, this is dependent on the kind of media that people are receiving. And in Serbia in particular, this is a question about how the war is being reported. But the general view, I believe, this is from a US perspective, is Putin is severely discredited. Russia is severely discredited. The Russian model, and I would even say similar authoritarian models, are discredited. The Russian military and information war, this prowess that of the Russian military machine, every day discredited, not just by brutality, but sheer incompetence, even recklessness, attacking Europe's largest nuclear facility, for example. Particularly related to the Balkans, what's been discredited, the idea of imposing one country's concept of history and denial of another's identity, discredited. I would say the idea that you can balance between Russia and the EU and the US as well has been deeply discredited. The idea of two chairs for Serbian President Alexander Vučić, this to me, the space for that has vastly shrunk. Autocracy and media repression also deeply discredited. The notion that NATO is brain dead, obviously completely overtaken by events. We see that finally countries like Germany are listening to the long-standing appeal of several US presidents to increase their defense spending with transformative commitments on defense. The notion that EU enlargement doesn't mean anything, of course, clearly shaken by events there and the desire of Ukrainians to join the West and the EU. The notion that sanctions don't work. We don't know in the end what Putin will do and how this very dangerous crisis could end. It could still escalate into a very dangerous confrontation. But no one can say that these sanctions have not had a severely punishing impact. I would just sum it up this way very briefly. When Switzerland joins sanctions, you know they are significant. A neutral country like Switzerland, which has. The notion that arms embargoes work to contain conflict, completely discredited. And here we should pause and note and remember the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. And we have with us, some of us on here who do remember those wars, myself included, and the shelling of and the siege of Sarajevo. Ukraine, 3.5 weeks of war. Bosnians, 3.5 years of war. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of shells raining down on Sarajevo. The complete destruction of Vukovar by Serbian forces using tactics like the Russians have used here. So we should pause and remember that, Bosniaks and Croats were denied the ability that Ukrainians have to receive Western weapons and defend themselves. And then finally, the notion of energy dependence on Russia, also very important concern for the Balkans as well, which has had and experienced threats from Russia to have gas cut off. On the other side of the coin, what the Ukrainian defense has inspired, this is the positive side of this invasion. and I'll just quickly, very briefly read these to you. They should all be familiar to most people processing this this news and the leadership of President Zelensky and what we see from the Ukrainian citizens and the Ukrainian military. Moral and physical courage has been inspired. The notion of responsibility. This is particularly important for the Balkans. The notion that individual citizens have a responsibility for the condition of their country and cannot just say, oh, well, what can I do? The notion of national and international support here. Leadership, the quality that we see here, the sharp contrast between Zelensky and Afghanistan's Ashraf Ghani. Liberal democracy has been inspired by the Ukrainian response and the desire to be free and to choose its orientation. US leadership has been inspired. The fact that we see what a contrast between models where the United States consults and shares intelligence, consults, does not negotiate above the heads of its allies. The West, the concept of the West has been inspired and solidified by this conflict. And we should point this out because of this solidity and unity across the Atlantic that is not shared in large parts of the rest of the world, not in Africa, not in parts of Asia, and elsewhere, where there's ambivalence, but very little ambivalence whatsoever, other than in some countries in the Balkans. Truth and facts have been inspired. We've seen the value and that it is possible to get the truth out, and even through social media networks. And I believe, very important for the Balkans, respect for national identity, respect for the notion that people have a right, an inherent right, to say who they are and what their own history is without interference from a larger, more powerful neighbor. And then just quickly to call out a couple of quotes here and to see that the impact of that this has had, not just on casual observers, but two quotes here from two of the leading scholars, Stephen Kotkin of Princeton, one of the eminent Russia scholars in the United States. And his quote here, that the courage of the Ukrainian people has galvanized the West to remember who it is. Very important. And we see finally from Timothy Snyder, every day that the Ukrainians are out there buys us a week or more of thinking about how things could be. The fact that they're doing something, the Ukrainians are doing something, this gives us a chance to think bigger. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to see if that chance extends to the Balkans, or if the Balkans will remain in the same zero-sum posture that it's been. And with that as introduction, I'll stop my screen share, and I'm very pleased to welcome first from Sofia, Bulgaria, we welcome Dr. Plamen Pantev, and Dr. Pantev is Professor of International Relations at Sofia University. And please, Dr. Pantev, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ed. Here are my bullets. 1. In the last 5 months, we witnessed how Putin's Russia shifts its geostrategic attitudes from strategic ambiguity to calculated irresponsibility, and to an unpredictable behavior of an angry and frustrated dictator who has lost himself in the labyrinth of world politics. The Primakov theoretically approved opportunism concerning Crimea, создалась возможность, и мы воспользовались. An opportunity arose and we utilized it, continues to navigate the adventurous mindset of Putin and his cronies, further downgrading Russia's image and political destiny. 2. After the brutal aggression against Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022, it is absolutely logical to expect new Russian brinkmanship performances elsewhere, including in the Balkans. First of all, Romania and Bulgaria are frontline states on the western coast of the Black Sea, The risks are high for NATO in light of the existing defense vulnerabilities and deficiencies of these two countries and the modest, rather inadequate presence of additional alliance forces. 3. The flow of refugees from Ukraine who stay in Bulgaria, already more than 42,000, has raised the social, economic, financial, and organizational tensions in the country and add to the post-COVID difficulties. Furthermore, the Bulgarian minority in Ukraine, the fifth biggest there, is more than 300,000. And our expectations are for receiving 150,000 refugees, Ukrainian citizens, including many of Bulgarian origin. So, Bulgaria has a stake in this war of Putin, who is responsible for the killings and atrocities against ethnic Bulgarians in Ukraine. 4. The hybrid warfare of Russia, trying to delegitimize Bulgaria's effective membership in NATO and the EU, has intensified, despite the expulsion of 11 Russian diplomats for spying against Bulgaria. The subversive activity includes influencing media, businesses, political parties, including continuing efforts to engineer new pro-Putin political entities in a traditional pro-Russian environment. Russian-generated strategic corruption and Russian malignant influences in Bulgaria are inextricably intertwined. The war on Ukraine naturally dilutes the pro-Russian attitudes and raises the sympathy to democratic and freedom-loving Ukrainians. 5. The sanctions on Russian economy and financial system led to raising the tensions in Bulgarian-Serbian relations, in addition to the present tensions of Serbia's hosting of a Russian military base a few kilometers from the Bulgarian border. The inability of the Russian Federation to pay the taxes in normal currency, but only in Russian rubles, something that is not provided by the treaty for transiting natural gas to Serbia via the Turkish Stream pipeline, risks creating huge problems for the bilateral relations with Serbia. 6. A lasting for years risk is the copy-paste phenomenon of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, in the Balkans. This is the Serbian world, with all its social and political metastasis, the various secondary malignant projections at a distance from the primary site of political cancer, the Russian world paradigm. As already mentioned, this paradigm, in its many-sided projections, is the other name of the strategic corruption poisoning our region. On the Balkans, these other projections are as follows. A, tolerating and growing the Republika Srpska and its Milorad Dodik phenomena, bearer of highest Russian orders presented personally by Putin. B, the non-recognition of the state of Kosovo by 4 NATO and EU countries, Romania, Greece, Slovakia, and Spain, and 1 EU country, Cyprus. This is a clear demonstration of the preferences of these 5 states in favor of the products of the Serbian world at the expense of the sacrifices of the Kosovo people, the West in general, and the security in the Balkans. C, last but not least, the domestic political deficiencies in the Republic of North Macedonia. This NATO member state has not revealed yet its totalitarian communist archives that would illuminate present-day links and dependencies of North Macedonian institutions, including political parties and security services, on their masters in Serbia, the most pro-Russian country in the Balkans. I do not mention the violation of human rights of the Bulgarians in the Republic of North Macedonia, and the unbearable anti-Bulgarian hate speech in the textbooks of children, at schools, and the official media. The message here is, we insist that NATO and EU member states in the Balkans should be functioning democracies. All these 6+ weak points are at the disposal of the Russian intelligence services and other official institutions to exploit, while a Russian-generated war is expanding in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Pantev, for those very clearly stated and concisely stated points. And I think it was illuminating for our viewers and our co-speakers, for myself as well, to know about the sizable Bulgarian community in Ukraine, which I was not aware of. There's some 300,000 citizens, and obviously the concern there of refugee flows. And I take as well your very strong points about the corrupt strategic vision there, and the comparison you make of Ruski Mir and Srpski Sviat, and the link between these two. I want to just take a moment here, the briefest moment here, to note that on the question of North Macedonia and Bulgarian-Macedonian relations, that we will hear from Dr. Ogden Vangalov later. He's a member of the Historical Commission and an expert in this field. And just to note, of course, for the record, in terms of being a democracy, that North Macedonia had qualified back in 2008 for NATO membership, was blocked by Greece, and resolved that long-standing concern in the compromise, the Prespa Agreement, in which both sides, Athens as well, and Skopje, made concessions, including the remarkable step of changing the country's name, and that the country has, according to the EU, qualified as a democracy to open its negotiations. So I just wanted to state that for the record, and then note that obviously Professor Vangalov will later in the program will be able to address those issues, because of course it's not only North Macedonia that hinges, it's Albania's own ability to open its earned EU negotiations that rest on this, and relieving finally the blockade from Bulgaria on that issue, and then hopefully this crisis can lead to movement on that. So our next speaker comes from another frontline state, and that of course is Romania. And Romania also facing an immediate refugee crisis, among other serious threats to its security and its neighbors, such as Moldova. And for that, we actually have two speakers. Same with Turkey. We have two speakers, two experts. We're very pleased to have this. We have first Oana Popescu-Zamfir speaking with us, who's the Director of Global Focus, and she will be followed by Mihai Sebe, who I'll introduce as well, head of the European unit at the European Institute of Romania. And the way we've done this to save time and to be efficient is we've asked our experts from Romania and from Turkey to divide in general without being categorical, but one will look at the immediate threat from the Russian invasion and Black Sea, land border issues and security threats, and then the other will focus on the implications for the Balkans as well as the relations with the wider EU and NATO. But again, those are just general orientations. And Oana, we're very pleased to welcome you, and you now have the floor there from Bucharest, please.
Thank you very much for having me. And you know, we don't follow rules in Central Eastern Europe, so we're gonna break them from the very beginning. And I will focus first on the immediate risks for Romania, but then also, since we read our own stability and security through a regional prism, then I will also refer a little bit to the implications for the region, including the Balkans. So to mention just a few of the risks for Romania without repeating what my colleague from Bulgaria said, I would start with the extremely important fact that the Black Sea was already an A2AD area for Russia, and you know, starting with the annexation of Crimea. And now if Russia keeps control, for instance, of the Serpent Island, then the situation only worsens for Romania and all of us on the Black Sea, with the exception of Turkey, perhaps, are quite helpless, should I say, by ourselves in front of the Russian threat. NATO essentially is the only one that can help Romania and Bulgaria secure their maritime spaces, and that's arguable considering the speed at which NATO can move to actually ensure sufficient deterrence capacity. Then the next thing is, of course, and it's been mentioned, the refugee flow, and with it, in time, the potential for the growth of nationalism, which we are already confronted with. And then as Ukraine and Romania have historically had rather tense relations before the Euromaidan, we actually expect that only to increase since we already see narratives emerging, which essentially say, why should we be helping Ukraine? Why would Romania be dragged into a war that concerns Ukraine when Ukraine has only been hostile, so to speak, to Romania throughout its history? Then the other risk is just the overall stability and security of the region, which is going to be perceived as problematic by investors. It's going to affect our economy through an indirect effect. And even though we're not going to suffer so much as other countries from the effort of decoupling from Russia, and it's actually more of an opportunity for Romania since we tend to be relatively self-sufficient from the point of view of energy, that is still at least going to involve short-term costs. And again, the potential that disinformation narratives are going to be circulated that are going to aim to show that it's the EU's desire to reshape its relation with Russia without consultation with Romania, that's going to push up the bills for energy and heating for the next winter and so on and so forth for Romanian citizens. And that's just going to amplify the already circulating thesis that countries in this part of Europe have largely been neglected by both the European Union and NATO and don't have voices as strong as those of their Western European counterparts when it comes to the decision-making process within these organizations. The other extremely sensitive issue is the Republic of Moldova. If the Republic of Moldova is destabilized in any shape or form, Romania cannot stand aside. Romania has consistently said Moldova and Moldovans and Romanians are one people, and there's also been a lot of talk of reunification of the two countries. But since we are both members of NATO and the EU, politically, decision makers, although they have cultivated throughout the years this nationalistic overarching theme, have been able to reconcile it with the no border adjustment principle within the EU by saying, but we will reunite with Moldova when Moldova becomes part of the EU and borders are going to be relevant, and that's why we support Moldova's European perspective. But if Moldova is either under attack or Transnistria wants to break away and pushes on with this, as it already has started, or Moldova is destabilized in any other form, then Romania has to make a decision. How are we going to be supporting those that we have been calling our brethren throughout history, especially contemporary history, without breaking our NATO commitments? And that's going to be itself a source for either growing nationalism in Romania or a potential force for economic destabilization and so on and so forth. Then the last an aspect, I think, a defeated Russia, and when I say defeated, I mean it might achieve a tactical victory, but it will have lost much of its international prestige and political room for maneuver, will probably focus on destabilizing weak states, but not only weak states in the region, also Central Eastern European and Western European states, through means that are non-conventional. So I assume we'll see a stepping up of malign foreign influence via kleptocracy, corruption, disinformation, cyber attacks, everything related to below the threshold and influence operations. And I think that is something that we are not prepared for and not resilient enough in front of. There are a few positive aspects for Romania, and I will just list them. The increased NATO cohesion, the strengthening of defense on the eastern flank, which we have been calling for a long time. The fact that Russia has now far less margin for maneuver because many of its narratives, as you have shown, Edward, have been discredited through this very brazen aggression in Ukraine. The energy decoupling and the economic decoupling from Russia, the fact that now we are able to actually confront the reality of revisionist countries and what that behavior looks like. And we see at the same time that the West as a whole has actually been able to wage much more influence than we have thought over these past few years. And now to just make a few points about the Balkans very, very briefly. I think the important thing to take away is that this European Commission started its term saying it would be a geopolitical commission. Not much of that has shown so far, but now it's got more geopolitics than it can handle. And it's time it lived up to its self-declared mission and initiated a rethinking of enlargement in this sense, meaning the EU neighborhood, East and South, is certainly European in its aspirations, in its historical and cultural identity, in its relations with the rest of Europe, and more importantly, in its strategic orientation. And these countries have, in their majority, chosen to align with the Euro-Atlantic community in the current global competition between, on the one hand, freedom, democracy, rules-based international order, and respect for human rights and civil liberties, where the West has shown that it still cohesively leads the battle, versus revisionism, war, crimes against humanity, dictatorship, and primacy of force, which Russia seeks to impose at least on its former sphere of influence, with the more or less tacit support of others. And I think this is extremely valuable for the EU itself, so more convergence with its neighborhood would be mutually beneficial and reinforcing, and not just a one-way process meant to modernize the EU vicinity. And if, as the West was in a dominant position for 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, we have failed to support the creation of a common space of stability, democracy, and peace that would include the EU's neighbors. And we now live every day with the threat of war possibly expanding to the EU or the prospect of nuclear catastrophe. We are handling the worst refugee crisis in Europe. I think all of these should make us think that this is the time to prove that we have learned this lesson fast, that geopolitics is back, and we need to work hard and fast on building that common space now, at least. And what that means is that while we cannot throw the entire EU accession process and its underlying principles down the drain and open negotiations with Ukraine just because it's being attacked by Russia, while keeping North Macedonia and Albania at the door, we must absolutely show more clarity of purpose and reframe the enlargement process to accommodate the common geopolitical Europeanness of these countries, while also consolidating our capacity to drive internal reforms. So to end, that means we need to rethink enlargement, turn it from a highly bureaucratic and demanding process that delays much of the political and symbolic reward until the very end, into one that offers more opportunities and rewards along the way as these countries do more to demonstrate strategic integration with the EU. That doesn't mean doing away with conditionality and reform. it actually means providing more incentive for it while we learn to better focus those interventions for reform too. So we'll take our time as countries go through the reform process. It won't go fast, but will reward in more palpable ways the fact that they have opted to align with the EU rather than anyone else, and to recognize their pro-democratic and pro-Western choices. Thank you very much.
Oana, thank you very much. That was great. And in fact, you did adhere mainly to the views that we appreciated very much, and in particular, that point at the end about how the concept of EU enlargement has to be revised, that it cannot be just this bureaucratic approach, but that we have to have an opportunity to create this common space. And I also note your use of this term, and I think it's a very important term, revisionist countries, and the need to tackle revisionist countries and revisionist agendas in the Balkans head on. And I believe Professor Pantev also signaled that. And here, you also used the word convergence with Jan Singel of Slovakia, who will come next after Mihai Sebe, and Luzin Petsi and others. We've co-written a report using that term, from crisis to convergence. And it's about time, as Professor Pantev states, for those countries, the four NATO countries in particular that have not recognized Kosovo, to do so precisely, Oana, to halt this revisionist agenda in the Balkans from Belgrade, with backing from Moscow. And with that, I give the floor over to our other esteemed expert from Romania, Mihai Sebe. Mihai, if you could kindly take the floor.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. In my short intervention, I'll mention for the beginning that the Ukraine crisis represents one of the gravest security situations in Europe after the end of the Cold War. And in spite of those who criticize the Euro-Atlantic cohesion and the European Union's relevance in unity, the recent evolutions prove once again the importance of the European integration project in ensuring peace and prosperity. In what regards Romania, even before the crisis, our country tried to promote the deepening of the European integration project, as well as a merit-based European enlargement policy in relation to the Western Balkan countries. For our part, we have actively assisted countries from the region in their further democratic progress and Europeanization. From the point of view of the Eastern neighborhood, Romania's position before the crisis was that the stability and security of the Eastern Partnership countries is first and almost all a geopolitical issue, and not necessarily a rule-based one and conventional approach. Before the crisis, Romania insisted for a more active European presence and an increased importance given to frozen conflicts in the region. As a consequence, when the Ukrainian crisis began, Romania was already involved from a diplomatic point of view in all Euro-Atlantic negotiation, and was already a serious partner that demonstrated a coherent Euro-Atlantic profile of Romania's foreign policy. The main risk of the Ukraine crisis at a primary evaluation was for the European Union that could splinter, that could have a fragmented Euro-Atlantic response to the events. Yet, as recent events have proven, this was not the case, and the worst fears were only remain hypothetical ones. The Euro-Atlantic partners responded in a coherent and coordinated manner as regards the Ukrainian crisis, both in what regards the Ukrainian refugees, as well as regarding the imposition of economic and political sanctions. For the EU-Western Balkan relations, the highest risk was that a slow and insignificant European response to the crisis would have reduced EU's ability to project itself as a strong political and economical partner for the Western Balkans. Given the difficulties of the Western Balkans accession process, the EU response to the Ukrainian crisis could have had an impact on how these countries define their European integration objectives. However, the crisis seems so far to have generated a very different result. The recent developments, especially the formal applications for EU membership by Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and Georgia, have created in the EU an optimistic public opinion as well as strong political support for the enlargement process that up till then seemed to be a dormant one. And while we need to remember from our own experience that the accession itself is a very complicated and time-consuming process, these developments could, on the short and medium term, represent a window of opportunity for the enlargement policy. This may have and should have a very positive impact on the European perspective of the Western Balkans, but we must also have in mind that any evolution should and must be directly linked to how each country reacts desire to reform, as well as to their reaction to the Ukrainian crisis. In what regards Romania, we have actively supported Ukraine and the Ukrainian people by sending significant quantities of medical and sanitary equipment, as Romania is more or less now an international hub for humanitarian assistance. And on the other hand, we have actively supported the refugees by providing accommodation and food, and also by facilitating their transit for those who are trying to get to Western Europe, or providing social integration for those who want to remain in Romania. As by 14th of March, we have more than 400,000 Ukrainians entering Romania. Regarding the crisis impact on Romania's position in the region, we will promote the advancement of the European integration because we strongly believe that the European integration and the process itself prove its significance during the recent events. We will support the accession of Western Balkan countries, a process that, in our opinion, should be based on an individual merit approach, as well as the European path for Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and Georgia, something that up till now seemed almost impossible from the point of view of having them as candidate countries. Also, it is the political and expert opinion that this European integration process should be doubled by a very strong transatlantic relationship, and the fact that the transatlantic partnership is vital for the security of our continent, especially for the countries situated in Western Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe. As has been the case recently, NATO presence on the eastern flank acts as a serious deterrent. As Europe seems to be more united in these days in front of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, it is important not to neglect the Western Balkans, and having this merit-based approach, we need to have all the EU expressing the desire and also the political intention to firmly anchor the Western Balkans on the European path. And this is a process that must start now. And we need to act decisively in anchoring them in the European trajectory, alongside giving the enormous emotional support for the region. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Mihai. And I'm going to turn it over shortly to Jan Singal in Slovakia. Before I do, I want to mention you and Oana both underscoring the importance of the EU perspective. And let me just underscore a phrase that Oana used that I think is extremely important here. And I'm going to quote her here, that when it comes to Moldova, Oana, I thought it was very important and striking what you said. Romania cannot stand aside. Romania cannot stand aside, and that, as I understood, pertained either to Russian military move or some formalization on Transnistria. Well worth noting, and Mihai as well, your points about the Balkans and the need, you and Oana, to solidify and advance the EU perspective. Now, with that, we're gonna turn to Romania's neighbor, Slovakia, also a frontline state with a border with Ukraine. And to do that, we're going to turn to Jan Singal, CEO of Strategic Analysis. Jan, also co-author of our report. And Jan, let me just, by introduction, note that Romania and Slovakia also share a concern of decoupling of ethnic Hungarian minorities sponsored from Hungary's Prime Minister Orban. And we will see and perhaps get your perceptions on how things have changed there with Orban backing sanctions and other steps. But Jan, let's turn to you for how this invasion is affecting politics and processes in Slovakia. Please, Jan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Edward. Well, the short answer would be huge. it's a huge impact, of course, on Slovakia, but I will break it down in more details, of course. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation for this great event. It is really an honor for me to be among such distinguished guests. Really glad to be among a couple of familiar faces which I have had already opportunity to cooperate with in the past. Slovakia, well, we are not the Balkan country, though me and my colleagues often joke that Slovakia should be considered the Northern Balkans because of the mentality and some on how some institutions are working, but also because of the cultural closeness and the social ties, and also our recent and not so recent, actually. It's quite a long-term interest, foreign policy interest in the region. So that's why Slovakia, I think, is quite relevant here. But the reason why we are here today is also because Ukraine is Slovakia's the biggest neighbor. Slovakia is bordering Ukraine, and this war, unprovoked war and aggression of Russia directly impacted Slovakia over the past 3 weeks significantly. I will be talking about two items. One is an internal political development in Slovakia that was impacted by the Ukrainian war. And then I will touch upon, of course, Slovakia's views on the Balkans and how the things might have been affected by the Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So first of all, war in Ukraine impacted the Slovak population psychologically. It's the full-scale war that is being waged right on our borders. The war in the 21st century was never so close to Slovakia as it is now. And we can see it daily because up until today, there were over 230,000 Ukrainian refugees that passed through border to Slovakia. 230,000 over 3 weeks. That's every day from 10,000 to 17,000. That's a really huge number. Of course, not all of them are staying in Slovakia. They're passing further to the Western Europe, but significant number stayed in Slovakia. And of course, Slovakia is coping with this huge challenge on a daily basis. So this is the first and most visible humanitarian impact on Slovakia's eastern border. Second is kind of an internal development. Today, very exactly now, the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is in Slovakia. He's discussing with his counterparts, among other things. I'm sure they're talking also about S-300 and MiG-29s and how maybe Slovakia could assist with those capabilities to Ukraine if they were turned to Ukraine. There was a discussion about this topic. It's not yet concluded, this discussion. Slovakia has those capabilities that Ukraine could use, but there are also lots of concerns. And for what is the most important, at the moment, there are no replacements for this hardware. So if Slovakia was to donate those S-300 anti-air systems, we would need new systems, of course. If Slovakia were to donate those MiG-29s, well, we already signed a contract about F-16, the new version, but they are supposed to come to Slovakia at the end of the year 2023. So there would be a gap in the protection of our air defense, and that we cannot afford at the moment. So there are discussions ongoing, and there are technical issues that needs to be cleared, and also some political hurdles that needs to be cleared. Just one maybe thing to mention. Slovakia is using MiG-29s, and those MiG-29s are kept by a group of Russian technicians, which are actually stationed in Slovakia at the Slovakia's airport where those MiGs are stationed. So it's a very, very strange situation that a country that is basically in the war with the West, or now we can say it even this way, is maintaining one of the NATO's countries' fleet of jets. So that's really very, very, very dangerous situation. Now, about the internal political changes that were brought about by the Ukrainian crisis, those changes were quite significant. Just over month ago, just a week before or 2 weeks before the war started, there was a huge discussion in Slovakia about signing a technical agreement between Slovakia and the US in terms of military. Even opposition mounted protests against American bases in Slovakia and really ridiculous claims trying to block this agreement between US and Slovakia. It was really a technical issue. And there were lots of political figures that were speaking on behalf of these masses, saying that the agreement with the US could provoke Russia, Slovakia could be even more endangered. And then this war happened, unprovoked war against Ukraine happened, and all those critics are now somehow silent because they see that the country that they were supporting or the propaganda they were kind of repeating, Russia, attacked our immediate neighbor. So this had really tectonic impact on Slovakia. At the moment, just 2 days ago, Slovak parliament approved NATO advanced presence. So there will be 2,200 or 2,100 NATO soldiers stationed in Slovakia, something that 1 month ago would be impossible to imagine. There will be even American soldiers among them, very probably, I hope so. Something that 1 month ago would not be possible even to imagine, because maybe I should note it, Slovak overall population has some pro-Russian sentiments, but those were kind of met with the reality when Russia attacked the Ukraine, because Ukraine is also a very close country. We have a close cultural ties and trade ties with Ukraine. So for many people, this is not it is understandable how one brotherly nation can attack the other one, one Slavic nation can attack the other one. Yes, of course, it happened in the Balkans in the 90s, but now in the modern history, this is something the population is coping through at the moment. Another aspect or another segment that was kind of shell-shocked by the Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the pro-Russian figures and pro-Russian disinfo scene in Slovakia that was before very actively bringing about stories about the Ukraine and peddling the pro-Russian propaganda. But when the actual invasion of Ukraine happened, they were kind of a shell-shocked in the first couple of days. They were not able to respond to what was going on, and luckily that time the media, the mainstream media, had opportunity to take over the narratives and explain what was going on in Ukraine in reality. So this kind of a Kremlin propaganda outlets, they are just starting now again with peddling the Moscow's propaganda. But at the beginning they were kind of a shell-shocked, and there was a delay in the response, which gave a kind of an upper hand to mainstream media and to those that are reporting directly from the ground. In general, as I said, there was a huge wave of solidarity with the Ukraine on the side of the Slovak citizens. People are helping the refugees. They are supporting the refugees. They are supporting the Ukraine. There is a really strong solidarity unseen before, and despite the fact that really some significant section of Slovak society is pro-Russian oriented, there is this kind of a shock that something like this can happen, and that a bigger neighbor can attack a smaller neighbor for reasons that are quite not understandable to common people. So I think on the information front, Russia is totally losing this fight. Another red line was also crossed with this war. Before, it would be unimaginable that Slovakia would be donating lethal assistance to Ukraine. Now Slovakia is supporting Ukraine with ammunition and with the air fuel, for example. So is actively engaged in supporting Ukraine's fight against Russia. Something that would be 1 month ago would be absolutely impossible. There are also some very interesting implications just 2 days ago, yesterday actually, three Russian operatives of GRU, three Russian spies were persona non grata from Slovakia. They were sent home to Russia because the Slovak military intelligence found out the way how they were operating in Slovakia. They arrested a couple of their sources in Slovakia, including one former civilian intelligence officer, including one high-ranking military official from the military academy, and one of the editors of these propaganda outlets that were spreading Russia's narratives. It's also on videos, maybe even accessible in your countries, how this Russian GRU guy, how he was trying to hire this editor from this propaganda outlet, how he was giving him money. It's all on video, also with subtitles, and it shows the way how brazen was the Russian intelligence operating in our country. But they were stopped at least this case, and they were sent home. Their assets were arrested, and then now there is a trial pending for them. Also, the Ukraine war was kind of a purity test for the Slovak internal political scene. As I said before, there were number of political parties that were either openly pro-Russian, or there was kind of a latent support for Russia. Now, after the breakout of the war, the populist parties, they quickly turned and they started to blame Russia for the war. They were speaking in support of Ukraine, and only those real staunch supporters of Russia, they remain in their positions, and they're peddling the Moscow propaganda. Now, getting to the Balkans to close my introduction, what we can see is first and foremost is the perception of that Serbia's position towards sanctions is unconstructive and damaging. Actually, I just returned from Montenegro yesterday, and we took a flight from Podgorica to Belgrade and from Belgrade to Vienna. And the significant part of the plane were actually Russian citizens moving between the countries and then further to Europe. So this has a quite significant. This is a kind of a signal of how sanctions might be leaking. That was one thing. The second thing is that Serbia should understand that it cannot sit on two chairs anymore. This position simply failed on 24th of February, and the side needs to be taken. And there are even some voices that maybe we should consider some more flexible approach towards the Kosovo issue, taking into consideration what is going on in Ukraine and how Russia basically undermined by recognizing so-called independence of Donetsk and Luhansk People Republic, how they basically undermined Serbia's narrative about the international law. And even before this narrative about the violence of the international law was based on a dubious basis, but now it's shown as a total farce. And last point is that this crisis definitely shows that Europe needs to be more united, and that includes also the Western Balkans and enlargement of the Western Balkans. The enlargement should be speed up, and the countries that are already in the European Union should not be blocking the potential candidates or candidates based on some internal and bilateral issues, because there are much more important geopolitical aspects to that. And with that, I would like to finish here. Thank you very much, Edward, once again.
Jan, thank you very much. And those points all very well taken. Let me just alert all of our speakers that to get everyone in, we're going to need to really focus on the 5 to 6 minute limit. Jan, those were quite interesting points, including the visit of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and that point that you made that the complexities and complications of Slovakia supplying to Ukraine those much needed weapon systems that President Zelensky alluded to in his very emotional and powerful and effective speech to Congress yesterday. And note that Secretary of Defense Austin also going to Bulgaria, and Greece has also come in to the conversation about potential supply of these weapons. And your points about Kosovo, very well noted, and the marginalization of the pro-Russian space. And Jan, as you and I, and Luli and others have recommended in our report, just returning Slovak troops to KFOR, completely safe and acceptable step would be a signal both to Belgrade and to Moscow there. And with that, Jan, again, my thanks to you very much. And we turn now to the fourth frontline state, playing a very interesting, multifaceted role in this crisis, and that, of course, is Turkey. Not applying sanctions, as far as I know, latest news, but mediating in the crisis, providing drones through commercial contracts to Ukraine, drones that have proven to be effective, quite effective, closing the Turkish straits, and also playing a key role in the Balkans as well. And to discuss that, we have, again, two experts, one more focused on the Black Sea, that dimension and the Russian threat, and the other more on the Balkans. For the first one, we're very pleased to have Özgür Özdemir, who is associate professor at Bilkent University there in Ankara, and then Aylin Unvernoy, who's a professor at International Relations at Haluk University in Istanbul, will follow you. Professor Özdemir, you have the floor, please. Welcome.
Good morning and good afternoon if you're in this side of the world. Thank you for the invitation for this very important event. I'm going to keep this short because of the time limitations. To give a little bit of a background for Turkish foreign policy would be good here, I think. For the last 6-7 years, Turkish foreign policy has been debated quite frequently, especially in the by the Western policymakers, within NATO, within Europe, and usually, of course, the criticism for Turkish foreign policy was that Turkey was drifting away from NATO, from its alliance with the United States, and certainly from the European Union and the European Union membership aspirations. And in addition to this, it was getting quite closer to Russia, and Turkey was engaged in a rapprochement with Russia, mostly because of what's going on in Syria and Russia's active role there, but in addition to that, in other sectors and fields, and also politically. Especially Turkey's purchase of S-400 aerial defense systems from Russia has been very difficult on country's foreign policy, because this led to US-led sanctions, and this has caused a lot of debate within NATO about Turkey. So at the beginning of this crisis where Russia invaded Ukraine, people and governments all around the world were not very sure about what kind of a position Turkey would take, but to many people's surprise, Turkey took a clear position on the side of Ukraine, both politically, but also militarily. I mean, Turkey is cooperating, Turkish government is cooperating with NATO. Turkey is supporting Ukraine militarily. Actually, there are 3 types of defensive weapons now NATO allies sell to Turkey: manpads, anti-tank missiles, and drones. And Turkey supplies drones to Ukraine, which, from what I read, is very useful for Ukrainian defense against Russia. So in that sense, like I said, Turkey has taken a very clear position, to many observers' surprise, within NATO and pro-Ukraine, and criticized Russia. And that is my first point. But the second point is that Turkey will certainly, I think, continue to be on Ukraine's side, but Turkey will also try not to provoke Russia, and Turkish government and President Erdogan has very good relations with President Putin and Russia. And I'm guessing that Turkey will try to maintain this middle of the way position between Ukraine and Russia, and will try to serve as a mediator between two countries. Because, well, in addition to all the security concerns mentioned by my other colleagues since the beginning of this talk, such as Romania, for example, Turkey is also worried about Russian aggression. But on top of that, we've got two things that many other countries don't have. One, Turkey is very interdependent with Russia. Turkey depends economically on Russian energy and tourism, and also international trade with Russia. That is one thing. But more importantly, Turkey and Russia has been cooperating about Syria for the last 7-8 years. And there's one major thing that is really scaring the Turkish government, which is if Turkey has worse relations with Russia, Russia can easily send 2, 3, 4 million more refugees to Turkey. I'm not going to go into details, but I'm talking about the situation in Idlib. And in that sense, the Turkish government also is very sensitive about not provoking Russia, because Turkey, as you know, is the country that has the most refugees in the world. We have more than 4 million refugees. And on top of the 4 million, if Russia is able to add 1 or 2 more million, it's a small-scale disaster, as you can imagine. Turkey is proud to be able to talk to both sides. Last week, the first high-level meeting between Russia and Ukraine was brokered by Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Antalya at this Antalya Diplomacy Forum. And obviously, according to the latest news, Turkey is also trying to directly mediate between Ukraine and Russia about a plan about Ukraine's neutrality. I don't know whether this is Russia's buying some time. One cannot be sure about that, but the Ukrainians were quite hopeful about the first draft of an agreement where Ukraine would be a neutral state in return for some security guarantees that it will not be invaded by Russia, and the guarantors of this agreement could be the United States, the UK, and Turkey. So I think Turkish government is very much involved in this mediation, and it will continue be so. The last 2 points that I'll mention is that one side issue in this conflict for Turkey is that Turkey has been maintaining a very contentious style of relationship with Western countries, especially with the United States in the last, let's say, half a decade, 5 years. And I think Turkish government is also trying to turn this crisis into an opportunity to repair the relations with the United States, because President Erdogan's style of foreign policy making is very personalistic. He likes to pick up the phone and directly talk to the counterparts, which was not the case with Biden administration. And there has been really strained relations since the last term of Obama administration. But I think my third point is that Turkey will also try to turn this into an area of cooperation with the United States, again, to be able to repair its relations with the United States, most importantly, but also with some Western European powers. The fourth one, Edward Joseph asked in the email whether there's anything interesting I could say. I thought about it. One thing that could be interesting is that I've been going to these Black Sea security conferences for 1.5 decades, and in every conference, people complain that Black Sea is not considered to be an important region, and nobody really cared about it, you know. But interestingly, now we are at a turning point in history that Black Sea may be really be a hot conflict. It's already a hot conflict zone, but it will be in the future a very high tension zone between East and the West, like Berlin in Cold War, or Cuba, or Korea during the Cold War, which I find very interesting after so many years of neglect. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Özdemir, and that was both very clear and very interesting. As you described Turkey's balancing act and this quite interesting potential ability and desire to repair the relationship with the United States. And just quickly to reference for you and for other viewers and speakers, that point you made about the progress in the talks, there's a story in the Financial Times about a 15-point plan, actually, that they've been discussing along the lines you described. And just finally, Professor Özdemir, as you know very well, Turkey and Israel have also been mediating, and apparently Israel's had a role in this 15-point plan. And I just note the significance of the visit of the president of Israel, Herzog, to and receiving a state welcome, very warm state welcome from President Erdogan recently. So the dynamics here are quite interesting, as you say. And for more on Turkey's role, and again, the perspectives with respect to the Balkans, we turn from Professor Özdemir to Professor Aylin Unvernoy, Associate Professor of International Relations at Haluk University in Istanbul. Professor Noy, please, you have the floor.
Thank you for a kind introduction, and thank you for your invitation to the special event. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And as you said, I will focus on Turkey's role in the Balkans, but first starting from the Ukrainian crisis and its impacts on the Balkans. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is neither the first example of its military expansion and expansionist policy, nor the first example of its effort toward NATO expansion. There is a belief that Russia will not stop in Ukraine if the Western policy fails to stop it. And naturally, this raises a question that which country or which region will be the next target of Russia. So Russia is likely to expand its confrontation with the West in the Balkans. In fact, previously, Russia had tried to prevent some Balkan countries from joining NATO. That's why Russia was behind the military coup attempt in Montenegro in 2016. And the efforts of Russian diplomats to change the decision of Greece, which has been vetoing NATO membership for years due to the name issue of North Macedonia, was a product of similar goal to prevent Macedonia to become a NATO member. Today, there are special risks, especially for states locked in ethno-national disputes due to the reality that some Balkan countries, especially non-NATO ones, are more vulnerable to Russian meddling. Well, what role Turkey can play in resolving these ethno-nationalist disputes before they turn into conflict? First of all, I would like to answer this question, why the Balkans is so important for Turkey. Because of geographical proximity, historical, social, and cultural ties, Balkans is of particular interest of Turkey. And Turkey's policy towards Balkans is to give priority to bring and maintain peace and stability in the region. In this respect, for Ankara, resolving disputes is vital. As you all know that Bosnian crisis emerged after the Bosnian Serbs war for withdrawal from the Bosnian state institutions and their call for a Serbian world that aims to unify all Serbs. This move towards secession could trigger a conflict. Any conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina might trigger similar problems for the other countries in the region that we don't want to see. Any act of resolving disagreements in the Balkans is utmost important at this turmoil. And actually 2 months ago, Turkey and Serbia agreed to broker Bosnian crisis talks by bringing together all three leaders of the Bosnia presidency for meeting either in Ankara or in Belgrade to reduce the tension to resolve the crisis. And Turkey's diplomatic efforts with Serbia are valuable efforts to ensure stability and peace in the Balkans. And Turkey's proactive foreign policy and its willingness to mediate between the parties are important to maintain stability and peace in the Balkans. Turkey has historically close relations with some countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also developed close relations with some Balkan countries in recent years. This makes Turkey is an important player in the Balkans due to its ability to talk all sides in disagreements. And the most recent example of Turkey's ability as a facilitator was bringing Ukrainian and Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs together in Antalya Diplomacy Forum. As you all know, that this was the first face-to-face high-level official meeting between Ukraine and Russia after the war in Ukraine. So Russia's invasion in Ukraine makes cooperation, changes many things in the world, and also makes cooperation in the Balkans especially a priority. Turkey, yes, can contribute creating bonds among the countries in the region, not only by bringing leaders of the region together to resolve their disagreements, but also through concrete infrastructure projects, such as Belgrade-Sarajevo highway that will connect the countries in the Balkans. Russia's invasion of Ukraine also might accelerate Turkey's new foreign policy approach, which is based on mending ties and normalization of its relationship with all regional countries. As a result of this policy and the need for energy diversification, it might pave the way for new areas of cooperation, like energy cooperation with Israel and Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. Russia's invasion of Ukraine might lead to countries of the region to reconsider not only their foreign policy approach, but also their policies on key areas such as energy security, due to disruption effects of this conflict on these areas. And Turkey, again, is an important actor that can provide alternative energy sources and routes to Balkans. Southern Gas Corridor, a transatlantic Adriatic pipeline that is carrying Azerbaijani gas through Turkey to Europe, can help Balkan countries efforts for diversifying their energy suppliers, which is needed for their energy security. So the energy issue is one of the important issues that Turkey and the Balkan countries can cooperate on. And of course, the last but not least issue is about the NATO enlargement in the Balkans. And the Ukraine-Russia war showed us that how important being a NATO member, since they're under protection of NATO's Article 5 collective security umbrella. At this point, the question is that whether Russia's policy of using hard power will prevent NATO's expansion or will accelerate this process in the Balkans. NATO should speed up its approach to application for membership from Balkans to bolster their defense and to protect their independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. With regards to NATO enlargement, Turkey supports NATO enlargement in the Balkans, and Turkey supports the strengthening of NATO with the bilateral relationship it has developed with the Balkan countries. Turkey helps countries that want to become a member of NATO by helping them to reach NATO standards, contributing their modernization efforts of their armies. So the overall effect of military cooperation between Turkey and the Balkan countries not only strengthen the ties, individual ties between the two countries, but also contribute to regional stability in the Balkans. In this context, military cooperation developed between Turkey and the Balkan countries is viewed by NATO as a stabilizing factor in the region. In conclusion, Turkey's stronger relations with the countries of the region also mean a greater consolidation of Euro-Atlantic security community in the region. As a NATO member, Turkey's strong political relations with the Balkan countries, defense cooperation with these countries, and its mediation role in the region further reinforce Euro-Atlantic security. Thank you for your attention.
Aylin, thank you very much for those remarks, which actually are a perfect segue. When your emphasis on NATO enlargement is a perfect segue to our next category. So we move from frontline states now to states that have substantial Russian influence. And one of those is, the first we'll be speaking about, is Bosnia-Herzegovina. And Aylin, your point about NATO enlargement, quite relevant to the story in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as we see a member of, early in the crisis, a member of Milorad Dodik's party raising a not so veiled threat about intervention from Russia due to Bosnia's advancement towards NATO. And for more on that, of course, we turn to our expert from Bosnia-Herzegovina, Srećko Letal. Srećko is a contributor to Balkan Insight and also a contributor to Balkans Crossroads, brings years of experience on the topic. And Srećko, we're very eager to speak to you. Obviously, when it comes to destabilization scenarios, Bosnia-Herzegovina is a prime candidate with, of course, the separatism and threats of Milorad Dodik, who, if you'll allow me to say, seems to be quickly trying to distance himself a little bit from Russia of late. And also we see perhaps even there could be some positive movement on those contentious issues between Croats and Bosniaks. But for all of that, Srećko, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
And obviously needed to this machine. So, I mean, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to participate in this event. And interestingly, how you divided the speakers along the line of the neighboring states and other states. And I can tell you that after the war has started in Ukraine, the general feeling, or to be more specific, fears in Bosnia and Herzegovina feel almost like Ukraine is on our eastern borders alongside with Serbia. So people are genuinely concerned about the possibility of the war from Ukraine spilling over, or at least some of its consequences spilling over into Bosnia and Herzegovina and the rest of the Balkan region. As you mentioned, one of the main reasons for these concerns are links that Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik has, or at least used to have, with Russia. I mean, for many years he was considered to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest, and the main supporter or follower of Russian President Putin. He was one of the top world leaders in the number of meetings with Putin. Somehow he was always managing to secure a meeting with Putin ahead of the elections. And as you may know, we are heading towards the next general elections that are scheduled in October this year. But because of the various serious crises in the country, even without the effects of Ukrainian war spilling over, it is uncertain whether the elections will take place, under which rules and regulations. But I would dare to predict that this time around, it is highly unlikely that Dodik will try to have a meeting with Putin and then try to win the elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Another reason, I mean, one of the main reasons, of course, why people are also concerned about a possible violence in the country is the fact that majority of the population still remember the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when we see footages of heavy battles and heavy destruction of civilian infrastructure and buildings in Ukraine, people cannot feel for these people and cannot not to remember their own experiences. But also, as you indicated, the interesting immediate effect of the Russian attack on Ukraine was the fact that many people and many officials in Bosnia and Herzegovina have stopped with their nationalist and populist rhetoric. It was the very strong and for the first time united EU and EU response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really shocked and awed in a way Bosnian and other Balkan leaders. And for the last 3 weeks, most of the Bosnian politicians who are known for their petty politics, for their zero-sum games, for their regular battles in the local media, have significantly toned down their rhetoric. And even Milorad Dodik, who with the rest of the Bosnian presidency has participated over the last 2 weeks in several high-level meetings, be it in Turkey or in Brussels or in Sarajevo with different international officials. He even went as far as to publicly and officially try to ensure European parliamentarians that he intends not to break the country apart. He does not have any plans or intentions to break away Republika Srpska from the rest of the country. But on the other hand, the fact is that many local people, local experts, as well as international officials don't trust him. Over the last few weeks, and in this very frantic situation in Bosnia and in the Balkans, there was a number of quite worrisome information which I have gathered from my different sources. Several of my local sources told me that Russia has contacted Dodik and has even went as far as to offer him their support in case he decides to use this opportunity and run for the exit, or in other words, to declare independence. Although, to be very honest, these reports cannot be publicly and independently validated. And so far, there are no indications that Dodik has responded in any positive way. In fact, as I already said, he is keeping a rather low profile. And for the time being, it seems that he has turned down the Russian offer, or at least is ignoring it for the time being. You also mentioned NATO membership, and this is, I would like to stress, still a highly controversial issue for Bosnia and Herzegovina as well as for Serbia. There was actually an interview which Russian ambassador to Bosnia, Kalabuhov, gave a few days ago, in which he essentially indirectly threatened Bosnia with the Ukrainian scenario if Bosnia decides to move towards NATO membership. But the matter of fact is that even without Dodik, it is highly unlikely that a majority of Bosnian Serb population would vote for something like this in eventual referendum for NATO membership, at least not without Serbia joining NATO in the same at the same time. And this is the second important element that you needed to understand, that the Serb-dominated entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, is probably more than ever linked to both politically and economically with the fate of Serbia. And many Bosnian Serbs are looking at Serbia and at the results of the fast approaching general and presidential and local elections in Serbia that are taking place on April 3rd. And there is a general understanding, and there was general understanding even before these elections, that many Bosnian Serbs would follow the suit and the example of Serbia and Serbian leadership. So as this issue was discussed in the past, NATO membership should be considered, I would say, only as a package deal for Serbia and for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and certainly not separately. But you know, and then I will try to cut my presentation short and leave as much time for questions as possible. I think that at this stage we still cannot fully assess the all security risks that are associated with the Ukrainian crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina or in the Balkans, primarily because we really don't know still what does Putin really wants, and where and when will he stop and how. So in case there is a deal in relatively short period of time, deal between a truce between Ukraine and Russia within the next few days or weeks, I would say that, and according to my local and international contacts, it would be quite possible that Russia would be willing to exchange its stakes in the Balkans for some kind of appeasement and or better positions in Ukraine, because the matter of fact is that Russia really does not have major interest in Bosnia or in the rest of the Balkans. I mean, as a number of good papers and analysis pointed out, Russian interest in the Balkans was primarily minimum investment leading to maximum results. Again, Russia seems to be focused on its immediate neighborhood and would be probably or hopefully would be willing to exchange its positions in the Balkans for, you know, some sort of arrangements in Ukraine or in the immediate neighborhood. On the other hand, most of the local and international experts that I've been recently talking to agree that, you know, the longer the war in Ukraine lasts, the greater will be risk for potential Russian mischief in Bosnia. And, you know, many people, especially security officials, they stress that Russia doesn't even need support from either Dodik or any other pro-Russian politicians or groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina or in Serbia or in Montenegro. The matter of fact is that at any given moment in time over the past several years, Russia was keeping certainly a number of its agents in the region. And given the heightened tensions in Bosnia and in the rest of the Balkans, even a small orchestrated incident, be it in northern Kosovo or in Brčko or anywhere else, could go a long way and could create serious problems, even start new violence. And again, I'm coming back to the question for all of us, which probably only Putin can properly answer, and that is, what does Russia really want, or what does Putin really want, and where and when and how he intends to stop? Because the longer this war lasts, there will be a greater possibility for creation of a bipolar world with new, much higher, much thicker iron curtain between the East and the West. And many experts, including myself, are concerned that in case of that scenario, a part of that border between the East and West would be running through the Balkans.
Forgive me to jump in. You're making a critical point there, and I apologize for the interruption. But it's 11:03. I have a message from SICE Events. They have another Ukraine-related event today, and we're going to have a hard stop sometime just a little bit after 11:30. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to stick to the allocated 5 to 6 minutes. And Srečko, thank you for that. Thank you. You set us up perfectly for the transition to Serbia by noting the connection and the interest and the linkage between Republika Srpska and Serbia and the interest in Serbian elections. And so, and as well, you noted the destabilization scenario if this war continues, quite important point. And you noted, interestingly, the fact that the Russians could operate even without Dodik or Vučić. I'm not so sure more widely how much they could carry out without some cooperation, but that's quite interesting. But to turn to the Serbian perspective, Srečko, with your permission, I want to, thank you so much, Srečko, and I want to welcome Milena Lazarević from Belgrade. And Milena, we are very pleased to have you with us. You are the program director of the European Policy Center there in Belgrade. And obviously we've been listening to Srečko. We've been hearing as well, Milena, you know, in the past couple of days, we've heard quite strong appeals from European Union officials Petrostano, appealing, making a very clear, strong appeal on Serbia to adhere to the sanctions regime on Russia, and the EU ambassador noting his concerns, very clear concerns about what he calls the misinformation provided to Serbian citizens about the war. And Milena, will turn to you to hear about the Serbian position. We've heard a lot about these shrinking space for two chairs. And we know, of course, elections, very important elections coming up. So Milena, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Edward. And I have my stopwatch on here in order to stick to the time, because I'm afraid that if anybody else goes over time, the remaining speakers won't have any time to make their remarks. So just as a small, a very short overview, how it all started. Basically, after the start of the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the Serbian government and the Serbian president, together in a Security Council, Domestic Security Council meeting, came to a very I would say very timid and very, I would even say embarrassing for many of us, embarrassing statement in which Serbia did endorse territorial integrity of Ukraine, but it only called the invasion as a breach of integrity and territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and called it very wrong. So it failed to actually condemn the act. At that time, the president in a national address also said that in any decisions regarding sanctions, in any future decisions, Serbia would exclusively be led by its own national interests. This, of course, opened, I mean, at that time, it clearly meant that Serbia would not endorse sanctions towards Russia. But I think it also left a little bit of space for ambiguity and future changes of the position, which, you know, us optimists hope might happen after the elections. The biggest change happened on the 2nd of March with the Serbian, with Serbia voting in favor of the UN of the UN resolution in the General Assembly, in which the aggression of Ukraine was clearly condemned. There was a huge diplomatic engagement by the EU, all member states, and by the US preceding these decisions. So it was extremely difficult to actually get to the point where Serbia would not abstain or leave the room, but actually vote in favor of this resolution. But I do think that it did make an important landmark in this whole process. And we can actually see, because those of you who in the audience who follow a little bit the situation in Serbia, you know that Serbia is far from being a functional democracy today, and that a lot of the politics in the country is actually run through government affiliated and tabloids and media. And what we actually could observe is a huge, well, not huge, still not huge, but a visible difference in the articles and coverage of the war in Ukraine before the 2nd of March and after the 2nd of March. Whereas in the most well-known pro-government tabloid Informer, before the 2nd of March, we could even see the title, Ukraine attacked Russia. Interestingly, after the 2nd of March, there was more coverage of the situation in Ukraine, the sieges of Ukrainian cities. We could even see more and more of the warnings about the outcomes and the consequences of the war. For example, one of the titles was "Shock: Putin is sending Syrians and Iranians to Ukraine," and things like that. So we can see that there's been a gradual shift of the tone in these pro-government tabloids. And sometimes, you know, we joke that the direction of foreign policy can actually be followed through these government-led tabloids, and unfortunately, this to an extent holds true. So we can observe some change there. Of course, I mean, this kind of change came because Serbia was given a very clear message by the EU that if it does not, get on the right side, its EU accession process will simply stop. And I think that right now the European Union is showing a maximum extent of tolerance towards Serbia's situation, where there are two main factors which are actually holding Serbia back and which are making it, of course, much more difficult for this government and for any other government. I mean, I have to be very open and honest that none of the opposition parties has called for support to sanctions either. So one of those factors are the elections, which you mentioned, and the other one is a huge energy dependence that Serbia has from Russia. So here we come actually to the question of what EU actors could do. And I believe that for the EU actors right now, it is the time for vision and decisiveness when it comes to Serbia. I believe that there are already exchanges at high levels. I have been informed that there are already exchanges at high levels that are practically preparing the grounds for a change of position for Serbia after the elections. Nobody, I think, expects for this change to happen before the election, but after the election, I think, and again, as one of the optimists in my country, I think that we might observe a gradual shift and change in the position. I can just say that this is not maybe a major change, but it does again bring a little bit of optimism that Serbia has, for the first time a couple of days ago, aligned with one of the old EU's sanctions towards Yanukovych, former Ukrainian President Yanukovych, and several other individuals. These sanctions were renewed on the 2nd of March, and then around 2 weeks later, Serbia, for the first time, aligned with these sanctions. Serbia has also, in the months of January and February, aligned with 5 other EU's declarations condemning or critical towards Russia and Belarus, which really was not the case ever before 2022. So this gives us some space for optimism. And as I said, I believe that the EU actors should show vision and decisiveness. Since one of the persons in the audience had a question regarding how the EU could change its enlargement policy towards the Western Balkans and towards Serbia, I will just say that I think that it is time now for the European Union to really rethink the enlargement policy, to offer a much more credible and faster process, faster in the sense of politically delivering process. And together with our colleagues from Brussels, from CEP's Center for European Policy Studies, we have developed a proposal which focuses on reshaping the enlargement policy into a staged process, which would revolve around 4 stages and which would resuscitate and add political dynamics to this process. So I will stop here because I'm at 7 minutes now, and I promised not to go over time.
Milena, thank you for it being so disciplined there on the time frame and for sharing those points with us, and some gradual incremental movement there that you've noted within Belgrade. Of course, we see partners like former Prime Minister, now Speaker of Parliament, Ivica Dačić, completely insisting on Serbia's strong position on Russia. And I just have to mention these other steps, like the continuing flights, Air Serbia there to Moscow, mentioned, referenced by one of our other speakers. But I take the point that there has been, as you say, some EU and US pressure, and it continues, as I noted publicly with the call on sanctions. So Milena, again, thank you so much for that. We're going to now turn to our last category of speakers, and to ensure that we get them in, at least that we have our colleague Dr. Ogmen Bangalov from North Macedonia a chance to respond, because that's critical. And I note the time frame that we're working under here. I'm going to actually, if you all will permit me, I'm going to reverse alphabetical order on this last group. And instead of Aryan Starova from Albania, Aryan, with your permission, we'll go in reverse order. And let's take North Macedonia first and allow Dr. Ognan Vangalov to speak, and then we will he'll be followed by Montenegro.
Sure, with pleasure.
Thank you, Aryan. Thank you so much. And then Montenegro, Zlatko Vujovic, followed by Greece, Yanis Armakoulis, then Croatia, Jasmina Kuzmanovic, and finally, with your permission, Aryan, we will come to Albania there in that sequence. So now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, occasional co-author, Ognan Vangalov, their professor at American University of Skopje. Please, Ognan, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those in North America. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation for clarity, and I'm going to try to be quite concise in this presentation because we don't have a lot of time left. So please allow me to share it. And I'm going to stick to the questions that were outlined when we were introduced to this topic. So what changes and what doesn't when it comes to the Ukraine crisis and North Macedonia. So I'll bring up several points here. What are the recent developments in North Macedonia as a result of the Russian invasion? So first off, immediately after the invasion and after the announcement of the sanctions by the EU, the government of North Macedonia quickly aligned with the sanctions against Russia and therefore announced its quite firm position on the issue. When it comes to the public perceptions, there haven't been any polls. It's too early, right? There haven't been any polls regarding what the public attitudes are when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But based on some of my personal observations as well as others recently, it appears that there is a growing popularity on social media, especially when it comes to Russia's role in Ukraine. So it seems that part of the public accepts the Russian narrative of its legitimacy to intervene in Ukraine for the so-called denazification of Ukraine. For example, Levica, which is a political party that's appeared since 3-4 years ago, it translates as the left, and it came third in the local elections among ethnic Macedonians. The local elections were held last year. They appeared to support Russia. Just yesterday, they had their leader and the member of parliament. There are 2 members of parliament currently of Levica, met with the Russian ambassador to Macedonia, and based on reports, they called the invasion a special military operation, which aligns with what Russia is saying about its intervention in Ukraine. So, but these pro-Russia attitudes are quite recent, but are not a result of the invasion. They predate the invasion. So let me just speak about what some recent poll revealed, which is quite surprising to many in the country. So according to this recent poll, the perception for EU's role in the country or the EU's influence in the country has plummeted to just 9% compared to 45% in 2019. So it's been a drastic change in public perceptions of the role of the European Union in the country. Also in 2019, 43% of the respondents saw the European Union as the key ally of the country, whereas today a mere 13% think the same. And there was also a question on the alternatives. So a whopping 45% of ethnic Macedonians would support a Euro-Asia Union led by Russia, if that question appears today. Of course, this is something that's unprecedented and hadn't been seen before in the public attitudes in the country. So this brings us to the question, why is this happening? Well, all indications lead to a conclusion that it's because of the sole European integration, and this is key to changing attitudes in the country. So because of the Bulgarian veto, or a couple of vetoes that were introduced in 2020 and continued on in 2021 for opening accession talks with the European Union, it's obvious that the resentment toward the European Union is growing. So this resentment toward the European Union is mostly felt like by part of the population as a betrayal of North Macedonia. And this is what's fueling the turn toward the positive sentiment toward Russia of the part of the population. But it's important to emphasize that historically, at least politically, pro-Russian sentiment in North Macedonia has been almost inexistent or negligible. So if we put this into perspective, from independence in 1991, there has been almost an absolute consensus for Euro-Atlantic integration across the political spectrum, so from the left to the right, and across ethnic lines. That's very important to note. So public opinion polls in the last 30 years have consistently reflected the consensus in the society for the place of North Macedonia in the Euro-Atlantic community. Now, what are the implications for North Macedonia's regional and international relation? Well, it's clear that North Macedonia's key interest is to start accession talks for full European Union membership and have a clear accession map. The current crisis, it's way too soon to assess whether the Russian invasion of Ukraine has some kind of a profound influence on the situation in North Macedonia. But for now, the crisis does not seem to alter EU's stance toward North Macedonia, at least for the time being. If we take into consideration some of the recent statements by representatives of the European Union here in the country, for example, the European Union ambassador to North Macedonia, they have been quite ambivalent, actually. For example, the European ambassador to North Macedonia stated that an agreement with Bulgaria must be reached first before the accession talks can begin, which is quite a stark change from what had been claimed previously, that any kind of bilateral dispute, especially related to historical issues, cannot be placed on the table or in the framework, actually in the negotiation framework between the European Union and the country. So what's the problem here? It's that an agreement under the current Bulgarian terms that had been stipulated in the explanatory memorandum that Bulgaria sent to all the EU member states, and that was back when Prime Minister Borisov was in charge, as well as the parliamentary declaration adopted by the Parliament of Bulgaria in 2019 and its government's framework position. An agreement between the two countries based on these terms is highly unlikely, and it's kind of a euphemism to say that it's highly unlikely. It's practically impossible. So because if these documents are closely analyzed, they reveal that the positions presented in these documents and the narratives placed in the documents are very much, they resemble the narrative that Putin has used against Ukraine in his speech just prior to ordering the invasion on Ukraine. And for example, I'm not going to cite many of the stipulations in documents, but practically what these documents are saying is that the Macedonian identity is a product of communist ethnic engineering, and the Macedonian language is just a dialect of Bulgarian. And if it's to be mentioned in any of the European Union documents, it has to have an asterisk saying that it derives from the Bulgarian dialects and so on. There are many such stipulations, and it's going to take a lot of time to explain them all. But in any way, all these documents claim that if North Macedonia wants to become an EU member state, it must accept these positions formulated by these documents that Bulgaria has promulgated. So what are the implications of all of this? So there is clearly growing Euroscepticism, and as a result of that, there is internal polarization, which can create enormous problems both internally and regionally. And this is reflected in the fact that EU's reluctance or inability to influence a member state, Bulgaria, whose policies are seen to be fueled by extreme nationalism, leading to long-term antagonisms, could pose serious obstacles to the stability in the region. The new Bulgarian government that's led by Prime Minister Kirill Petkov has toned down this radical rhetoric that was quite visible in the previous administration, particularly from certain members in that government, the Defense Minister Karakachanov and Foreign Minister Zakarieva. And such rhetoric is not so much present anymore in the public addresses of Bulgarian officials. And the government has engaged in some kind of sectorial discussions with the government of North Macedonia. But what the problem remains, and it's a fact that these key documents that have been promulgated by Bulgaria's institutions remain to be enforced, and there is no change of policy. And any kind of compromise based on these documents is highly unlikely, as I said previously, or even impossible. So this kind of situation could undermine years of progress in North Macedonia and could as well undermine EU's influence in the country and in the region. And that's reflected in these recent polls that have been that have been done, and these are credible polls. The latest one was done by Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So all this tells us that it can open avenues for increased Russian meddling into the neuralgic spots of the region. So that would be my short address as regarding how the Ukrainian crisis can influence the region, but obviously the bilateral issues that have been on the table between North Macedonia and Bulgaria are still quite neuralgic, and it doesn't seem that there is any kind of progress so far on that front.
Thank you, Ognan. Thank you very much for that. And I can tell you there's great interest. I see on the chat there's great interest in your presentation. And when you stop sharing, I'll tell you that folks would like to get your slides. So if you could kindly pull the presentation off the screen, that would be great. And we'll hand it over to our next speaker. Thank you, Ognan. And let me just quickly add, Ognan, that what you laid out there, I think, is the single most shocking, stunning information that we've gotten, I think, from any speaker. That the fact that this blatant Russian attack, brutal, reckless, redolent of Sarajevo and Vukovar, has had this actually gained some support among Macedonians. This is absolutely shocking, and a reminder that obstacle, this is precisely the type of issue that absolutely it has to be resolved and swiftly.
I have to just, there has to be a reservation. So there are no public opinion polls that have been conducted after the invasion. So this is fully based on perceptions that are, based on social media discussions, right? So we can't really know what portion of the public is supportive of the invasion. It's very difficult to say, but if we, if we correlate these issues with a recent poll that was just done a month prior to the invasion, where the public's opinion are shifting with relation to the trust that the public has in the European Union, then it can be quite indicative. So, it's yet to be seen, right? But what's also important is that this a political party that's been growing in the last several years, called Levica, the left, has had quite clear stances regarding the problems with Bulgaria, Greece, and as a result, the European Union's role in the country. So there has been a shift in the public opinion, but again, regarding the invasion precisely, it's difficult to say right now because there is no data.
Sure, I understand, Ognan, and one hopes that, as Jan Singal explained to us in Slovakia, that those strains that would be pro-Russian, despite the problems with Bulgaria, that one hopes that, as in Slovakia, people would see the reality and adjust. But the concern is well taken about this obstacle. And again, it pertains to Albania. It's blocking Albania's movement towards the European Union, again, which it has earned, as has North Macedonia also earned that right as democracies, as functioning democracies, and having fulfilled the requirements. But, sorry, I've got to allow.
If you permit me, just very quick.
Let me slide on because we're going to run out of time here. And if we have time at the end, Ogden would be happy to have you back. But we're going to move to Montenegro now, and then following that will be Kosovo. But forgive me, Ogden. Excellent presentation, and again, demand from folks to actually see the slides. But now we turn to Montenegro, a country that has been labeled by Russia as put on an enemies list by Russia, formalized list, and a country with going through its own internal political dynamics. And for more on all of that, how this crisis affects Montenegro, its relations with Serbia, its relations with NATO and the region and the EU, we turn to Professor Zlatko Vujovic. Dr. Vujovic, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Joseph. Edward, it is really a pleasure to be with you today. So, public in Montenegro is strongly concerned regarding invasion of Russia on Ukraine and carefully is following war in Ukraine, as there are many similarities between our two countries. As Ukraine, Montenegro represents divided society where foreign influence is very strong. Serbia and Russia strongly interfered in election 2016 and especially 2020. Since 2016, when Russia tried to prevent Montenegro's membership in NATO, we are faced with strong interference of Russia and Serbia as its proxy in political life of Montenegro. In Montenegro live a significant number of Russian citizens, but mainly they are not interested to behave aggressively toward Montenegro. Problems are extremist, nationalist, parapolitical, and religious groups controlled and supported primarily by the Serbian secret services. Those groups now are very active in implementing Moscow's agenda in Montenegro. Montenegro intelligence is strongly damaged after the change of the government, and it's dominated by Russian and Serbian secret service. Russia doesn't have significant own resources in Montenegro, and this is very important to understand, as Russia actually uses the Serbian nationalistic group together with the Serbian Orthodox Church. Serbian Orthodox Church priests are fully supporting Russia's attack on Ukraine, and Serbian Orthodox Church represents in Montenegro the strongest ally of Russia that is also financially supported not only by the Russia but primarily by the Vučić. As Montenegrin society is very divided, this conflict in Ukraine also divided society on this, let's say, issue. So those who are mainly supporting pro-Serbian oriented political parties and groups are supporting Russia. We had even some very small protests in support of Russian invasion on Ukraine. But this is a fact. On the other side, there are also political parties that are pro-Russian in Montenegro. The biggest still ruling political party, Democratic Front, and its coalition supported by the Serbian Orthodox Church has 2/3 of the seats when we are talking about still ruling majority, but also these are not only pro-Russian political parties. So now Montenegro is in a very specific situation, as we are in the process of formation of the new government, because after the no confidence vote in the parliament, this government, the prime minister and the government doesn't have any more support of the parliament. So there are strong attempt right now to give 1/3 of the seats in the government to one pro-Russian party, including key position in security sector, including also the position of the Speaker of the Parliament. Speaker of the Parliament is also a member of Montenegrin Security Council. Montenegrin Security Council controls the military. He's something like the collective head of the army, head of the army. So actually, that body decides about any role of Montenegrin army within the NATO. and it is all decisions are needed to be decided unanimously. So actually, if this agreement will become reality, the pro-Russian politician could block any decision of Montenegro within the NATO activities. So the Russia doesn't have really resources in Montenegro when we are talking about the destabilize the situation if those resources are not shared with the Serbian, because the Serbian, there are a lot of the, let's say, parapolitical groups, organizations funded by the Serbia that are very active now in supporting the Russia. They are getting the funding, not only by Serbian authorities, but also directly by the Russian authorities. We have this case of the coup d'etat attempt in 2016 in order to prevent Montenegrin membership in NATO. And those forces are still very, very active in Montenegro. In order to stop Russian attempt to destabilize political situation in Montenegro, it is very important that to, let's say, support the ideas and to encourage pro-Western parties in Montenegro to form the pro-European government without participation in the government of pro-Russian parties such as Socialist People's Party. In order to stop Russian attempt, also, it is very important that US and EU stop closing eyes on activities of the Serbian authorities in Montenegro, aligned with the Russian interest. I am referring to the Vučić-controlled media, political parties controlled by the Serbian president, and different parapolitical situations. Russian capacities in Western Balkans, at least in Montenegro, to destabilize political situation without using Serbian resources are very limited. So it is of high importance to stop Vučić providing services to Putin's Russia. EU should make concrete moves in order to show Western Balkan that can join the EU very soon. Western Balkan needs fast and concrete proofs. EU was too much hesitating, and definitely they should not make mistake like they made in Ukraine. Well, this situation is very dangerous for the Western Balkans because I think there are a lot of the realistic concerns regarding the Russian interference and possible, let's say, causing even the conflicts in the Western Balkans. But I see this also as a window of opportunity to decrease the involvement and also the strength of the Russia and its proxy in the Western Balkans, because now we are witnessing also very strong mobilization of pro-Western forces in the Western Balkan, and that definitely should be used in the proper way.
Dr. Vujovic, thank you so much. Thank you for adhering to the time. We're really running short. I'm going to, without any introduction, just simply hand it over to my friend Luli Petsi, who's the Executive Director of Kipred there in Pristina. Luli, please take it away. And please note, we're under very short time frame here. At any moment, SICE events will come in. But please take it, Luli. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And it is a particular honor for me to be a part of this distinguished panel. My dear friends, Russian invasion in Ukraine has changed profoundly the European post-Cold War order. The fears that have been spelled out by many Western strategists in the beginning of the 90s on the possibility of a resurgent and hegemonic Russia nowadays are harsh realities that are shaking the security architecture of our continent. Nevertheless, throughout the last decade, and especially after the signing of the agreement on strategic partnership between Serbia and Russia on May 14th, 2013, that emphasized, among others, a strong military, economic, and diplomatic cooperation, the Western Balkans, and particularly Kosovo, became a target of the Kremlin's elevated diplomatic warfare and malign information operations that were aiming to destabilize the region and hit the West under its soft belly. We have to remind the fact that the signing of this agreement ironically took place few weeks after the European Commission recommended the beginning of the accession negotiations with Serbia. While being integrated into EU, Serbia strengthened its foundations as a harbor of Russian interests and actions in the Balkans, and we are living, unfortunately, this reality even today. Kosovo is almost fully surrounded by NATO countries, and the alliance-led peace enforcement mission KFOR is present in the country. But these facts are not sufficient to feel fully secured in the current environment. Last September, Serbia has been very vocal with the military threat towards Kosovo, while its troops dislocated close to the northern border of Kosovo were inspected by the Russian ambassador to Serbia, Hrashenko. Furthermore, after his meeting with Putin in Sochi on November 25th of the last year, President Vučić was praying for a fast shipment of Russian tactical weapons to Serbia, because according to him, there will be another important major things of strategic interest for Serbia in the near future and not in the distant future, thus implicitly announcing upcoming war in Ukraine. In addition, on the eve of invasion in Ukraine, Minister Lavrov started to compare the Serbian community-dominated north of Kosovo with the Ukrainian separatist regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, and the Minsk agreement with the agreement on association of the Serbian majority community municipalities, which is a matter of concern in Kosovo due to a very possible agreed coordination of Russia and Serbia in the light of aggression in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the possibilities for destabilization in Kosovo and the region are dependent from the cohesion and determination of the alliance towards the Russian aggression in Ukraine, on hotspots of the Russian influence in the Western Balkans, as well as from the will of local politicians to contribute to the peace and stability of the region by not using inflammatory language and acts. However, we shall not ignore the fact that defense spending competition has already started in the region, and it is taking strong patterns of security dilemma. The international isolation of Russia due to the invasion in Ukraine has strengthened the alignments of the regional countries with EU and NATO, with the exception of Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, meaning here Republika Srpska. In this regard, Kosovo has imposed sanctions on Russia, opened its door for 5,000 Ukrainian refugees, and has offered a military contingent to be dislocated to the eastern flank of NATO. This momentum should be used by EU and US, meaning here NATO, to accelerate Euro-Atlantic integration of the region, whereas US should make efforts to converge its policy with NATO's four non-recognizers to change their position towards Kosovo and ultimately recognize its independence, since they have voluntarily given a virtual veto and leverage to Serbia in the dialogue with Kosovo, and consequently, they are keeping the doors open for Putin's influence in the region. But on the other hand, it is very much depressing from my point of view to learn that the war in Ukraine had to start to notice a kind of flexibility coming from some EU non-recognizers towards the independence of Kosovo. With the exception of Greece, none of other non-recognizers have recognized the validity of the ICJ advisory opinion on Kosovo's independence. The first step that non-recognizers should do is to recognize the legality of independence of Kosovo, that should be followed in due time with formal recognition. The Russian efforts to deteriorate stability in the region will continue, and most probably they will increase depending on the developments of the war in Ukraine. Thus, opening the doors to Kosovo for EU and NATO membership by providing EU candidate status and partnership for peace will curtail and amputate the Kremlin's malign influence and will nullify the possibilities for destabilizing the region and the southern flank of NATO. In the end, I have to remind that Kosovo does not need UN membership to become member of NATO and EU. Thanks a lot.
Luli, thank you for that. And your arguments, of course, contained in our report, our Wilson Center SICE report on From Crisis to Convergence. And I just want to alert everyone that thanks to our colleagues at SICE Events, we can go to 11:50, but that's it. We only really have 5 minutes for our 3 speakers. My apologies. It's a tremendous crush here in Washington with other Ukraine-related events. And we cannot operate this event without our colleagues at SICE Events. So I'm going to turn to our Yanis Armakoulis, Senior Research Fellow at Eliamep. They're in Greece, and then Yasmina and Arian, Yasmina Kuzmanovic, correspondent with Bloomberg News in Zagreb, and Arian Starova, President of Atlantic Council. And if you can please, Yanis, I know you have a presentation, all of you, just to make some main points for us, Yanis. My apologies.
Just one minute. Ed obviously had many more things to say. Just Please. 1 minute. What we see today when it comes to Greece's stance on the Ukrainian war is a kind of a revolutionary change in what was traditionally being a policy of Greece not wanting to step on Russia's toes. So Greece had in the past followed Western EU and NATO policies, but always very cautiously without wanting to annoy Russia. What we see today is a very vocal anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian stance on the part of the 3 main political parties, especially the government, and also Greece sending military aid to Ukraine. This is also breaking a tradition of several decades in Greek foreign policy, and we see the government carrying with it the Greek public opinion, not fully, but to a large extent, which is again a big change if you compare to the Greek public opinion in the 1990s and its attitudes in the Yugoslav wars. I will stop here just to mention that Greece is in, I would say today, in best relations both with the US and overall with the West since the 1950s. And we can talk more about it in a future event, obviously.
Yanis, thank you so much. And again, my apologies. Just quickly, any movement on Kosovo? Any possible movement as a result?
As Luli mentioned, Greece has had the most constructive relationship with Kosovo among the 5 EU non-recognizers. I think the Greek policymakers probably surely know that they will eventually recognize Kosovo, but they are hoping that this will come out of after an agreement with Serbia. I think they will have to face the fact that maybe an agreement with Serbia will not come in the near future, and a recognition of Kosovo will contribute to the stabilization of the region.
Perfect. Yanis, thank you so much, and we will find a way to have another event and have you and our other speakers. Yasmina, thank you. Yanis, Yasmina Kuzmanovic, correspondent with Bloomberg News in Zagreb. Please, you have the floor.
Hi. So, hello everyone, and thank you. So, coming from the perspective of Croatia, and I'll also say something about Slovenia as another EU state in the Balkans. As a member of NATO, Croatia, and a member of the EU, Croatia is a strong proponent of the Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity, and the war has only increased that position. That's held by the government, and even our president, Zoran Milanovic, has backtracked a little bit on its criticism towards supporting Ukraine. I think we have to see here 2 key things. First is, and somebody mentioned on that, is the homogenization of the West, of the EU, and behind the line on support to Ukraine. It's been interesting to know that before the war, there have been doubts of how some of the populist EU leaders, not only in the Balkans, but I'm talking about Morawiecki, Zeman, Orban, of course, would react to this. Would they maybe hesitate to give support to the EU stance. But what happened was that we've seen that every one of them has fallen in line behind the EU. I mean, to an extent, it's really amazing to behold, even Orban. In case of Slovenia, Janez Janša, another thing I want to mention, all the crisis is actually great for those leaders in a sense that it's completely squashed any kind of internal political debate. So the opposition in all these countries is also pro-Ukraine, you know, pro-supporting Ukraine. So in Janša's case, he has kind of transformed himself from a populist leader that we've known into a kind of, you know, senior politician, what he should be, basically, a patrician European politician, somebody who has led his country into the EU, into NATO back then. And he probably remembers his time as a defense minister in Slovenia when Slovenia fought for its independence in a 10-day war. So all these EU leaders are now firmly behind the EU line and very critical of the Russian aggression. Now, how is this touching the Balkans, and not only the Western Balkans, but also Croatia primarily, which is a signatory to the Dayton Agreement, which has a stake here through Bosnian Croats. There are factors since the end of the war, since 1995 or 1999, if you want, that have not been happy with the geopolitical structure that's been left in place here when the war finished. So they were not happy with the Pax Americana, as it's called, that is left in this area. Back then, Soviet Union, that's Russia, was too weak to actually react because it was preoccupied with the fall of the Soviet Union. Now the situation is exactly the opposite. So factors in the Western Balkans that are not happy with the situation are finding that this is an opportune moment to react. Not that all this time we haven't seen various disturbances. I mean, my colleague from Montenegro mentioned that, you know, the 2016 attempt of a Russian coup against the sitting prime minister, the situation that we have in Bosnia with the Bosnian leader Milorad Dodik. So now the thing is, how is the conflict in Ukraine, which we don't know how it will end, we don't know what is Putin's endgame, how is it going to basically influence the situation in the Western Balkans. And we have here two things. We see that countries like Croatia and Slovenia that are already the member of the EU and NATO, they've shown during the previous COVID crisis that is still lasting, still continuing, is what are incredible tangible advantages of being part of the EU. Economically, first of all, the economic fallout was much softer because these countries could use the fact Slovenia is in the Eurozone, the fact Croatia is in the Eurozone waiting area, ERM2, that they could use the value swap with the ECB to support their currency, not to spend international reserves. So this is all a big factor that the other, you know, countries in the Western Balkans are looking at. The other thing that Croatia can play and that the Western Balkans country can play, what I think Milena mentioned that in Belgrade, is now the battle, if you want, for Serbian hearts and minds. There is already a motion in Brussels, a letter from liberal MEPs to ask if Serbia's accession talks should be stopped. A Latvian official the other day also broached this subject, asking in a way to stop the accession talks. From the neighboring countries like Croatia that has a stake, as we said, it seems nothing would be easier than to say, okay, Serbia, you know, no more EU aid, you know, we are cutting the talks. But actually, the EU should do the opposite. And the EU should not just, after all this investment and effort and talks, just let Serbia go to the other side. And in that way, there is an ongoing proposal by the Slovenian President Pahor and also by the Croatia's former Deputy Vice Premier Vesna Pusic to launch some kind of mechanism to help Serbia go through that and maybe allow it to keep, for Vucic to keep sitting on both chairs, so to speak. And this is.
Can you permit me to jump in with apologies? But you've made great points. We're just unfortunately coming out of the time. I just note your points are so well taken, and so timely because Croatia, as we speak, is meeting at high levels with the United States as part of its strategic dialogue. So these concepts, and your point about Croatia's role with respect to Serbia, extremely well taken. Aryan Starova, you've been so patient, President of Atlantic Council in Albania, former Deputy Minister of Defense. You have the floor, just please, a minute or two.
Thank you very much. I'll be very, very short. Of course, I'm going to speak several points because they were exhausted during the webinar. But first, thank for the invitation. And I'm pleased and honored to be with you and to share opinions with my colleagues and friends. I would just read some of my talking points under the title Echo of Russian Aggressions in Albania and the Balkans. Ukrainian resistance, heroic and going through bloodshed and big damages, is serving as a deterrent for the Balkan security. So far, and as a catalyst for pending final solutions of the Balkan security problems, very different from the first days of the Russian aggression. I insist on that because in the first 2 days, which were in some minds going together with the plan of Putin's Russia, that they would dominate in Ukraine, even the concern in the Balkans and Albania were bigger. Now, this concern, and not anymore like that, but a little bit, but they are there anyway. Also, there is a general security concerns in the Balkan focused on Serbia and Bosnia, especially because of their recent increased military budgets for several years already. Hence, there is some kind of public pressure on the other Balkan countries to further increase their military budgets, even in Albania as well, despite the economic problems and so on. Another point, among the most significant changes as a result of the Russian aggression are some economic constraints, but not that much like in other countries which are bordering Ukraine. At this point, I would like to say something, how important was the decision of the previous government to construct Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which now has started its operation, and it's like an alternative pipeline of sending energy to Europe compared to the other ones. So it's a step towards independence from Russia. Another factor is a deeper popular awareness on Putin's Russia intentions as a threat in Albania and the Balkans. Also, you know, Albania has given substantial support for Ukraine, also joined the sanctions and so on, not to remain very long here. These days, these 3 weeks, certain weaknesses of some Albanian media has come out, and that's very, very concerning because it is probably a sign of the Russian propaganda influence. For example, recent media articles shown uncertainty of democratic political system or contradictory facts over Ukraine war, disinformation of the subject of diplomatic negotiations going on between Ukraine and Russia. Also, there are clearer and more widespread opinions of the looming failure of the dialogue Kosovo-Serbia as a non-substantial and a phony one, just dealing with not substantial ideas. Higher expectation from NATO attitude on the Ukraine war, higher expectation from NATO KFOR in Kosovo in case of a possible Russian proxy armed conflict. And now I will read just some general ideas of what can be done in the future in order to be late, but to be earlier than late, like this time with Ukraine, leaving aside Crimea and Georgia before. EU countries must recognize Kosovo and radically change their position in Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, together with other intermediation like Russia, like Americans and Britons and Germans and others. More serious attention to arms control processes in our region. Tougher stand of EU to Serbia's foreign policy, either Russia or EU integration, not to chairs, as the previous colleague mentioned it. Acceleration of Euro-Atlantic integration in the Balkans, of course, for Kosovo and Macedonia first, EU, but even NATO. There is a grave need also of a full European consistency on sanctions against Russia. As we know, some of the countries of Europe are still importing energy from Russia, and that's not good. When in Ukraine, what's happened on every a no-fly zone or an ultimatum for imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine is increasingly becoming a necessity.
Thank you, Aryan. Excellent points. You've been very clear, both in your analysis of the implications and in these suggestions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, really, I am so grateful to you. Those were very clear. I stopped you at no-fly zone because this was the subject in Washington yesterday, the speech by President Zelensky. Obviously, this is highly complicated.
May I only say one last sentence?
Please.
With your permission?
Go ahead.
There should be no risk and no fear of a World War III because Russia is becoming more and more weak and alone.
Well, that's, I take your point. There are others who are quite concerned that precisely for that reason, the cornered Putin problem. And so, but thank you. And you, who knows, but in any event, that discussion of how perhaps Ukraine can create its own no-fly zone will continue with Secretary of Defense Austin's visit around the Balkans. I want to thank all of our speakers for these excellent presentations, and especially our last three, Aryan, Yasmina, and Yanis, for being so compressed and collegial with us about that, but you still, each of you, conveyed essential points to us and to our audience. I want to thank our audience, and most of all, I need to thank SAIS Events and send my apologies, but deep gratitude and sincere gratitude for allowing us to just complete this event. This is Edward Joseph in Washington with SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. Please join us in the future. We'll be speaking with all of these experts again at some point as we focus on the Balkans, the wider region, and this crisis due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I wish you all a good day. Goodbye.